Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you. I'm so super delighted to be introducing this Cradle Seminar webinar on the Manifesto for Feedback in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And I'm more than delighted because of my wonderful colleagues who are here. I will move to acknowledging country, and I would love to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands. And that does say Wurundjeri country, because I was intending to be at work when I did these slides, but I'm actually at home. So I am on the lands of the Boonwurrung people here. Wurundjeri country and Boonwurrung country butt up against each other. So I would like to pay my deep respects to the ancestors and elders of Boonwurrung country, which is where I am at the moment, which is where my home is. And of course, people who are from Australia certainly are putting countries and paying their respects to countries in the chat. And I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists as well too. So we have, in order of my screen, which might be different to yours, Anna Jones, who's from King's College London, but is actually here in Australia, and I believe might be in Naarm as well too. We have Naomi Winstone, who is from the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom. Christy Noble from Brisvegas, the University of Queensland. Karen Gravitt, also from University of Surrey in the United Kingdom, and my dear Deacon colleague, Kelly Nicola Richmond. So that's the panel, Anna, Naomi, Christy, Karen, and Kelly. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the origins of the manifesto. We were very fortunate to be at a King's College, University of Copenhagen, University of Melbourne, Deakin University co-hosted symposium at the University of Copenhagen. That's the big tower we were in at the University of Copenhagen in May last year. Bunch of wonderful feedback researchers and general researchers, general higher ed and health professions education researchers at this symposium. And this is where the idea from the manifesto came. So I'd like to acknowledge everyone who contributed to the manifesto, particularly Lhasa from University of Copenhagen, but also Thomas, Renska, Catherine, Raj, Amura, and Gabrielle, or Gabe. And then the other members of the symposium, Rochelle, Walter, Torsten, and Liz. And acknowledge the support of the Carlsberg Foundation and Novo Nordisk Foundation. So that's enough from me. This is going to be the order of it. We're going to have an introduction to the manifesto, some scenarios, a very different way to do the panel, open questions through Q&A, and then some concluding thoughts. So I'm going to stop talking, turn off my video, and hand over to Naomi to talk through the 10 points of the manifesto.
Thank you, Margaret, and good morning or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us to share the journey really of some work that started in Copenhagen, but that is ongoing and hopefully will continue. So the manifesto itself, Margaret has shared the link. You're able to access that. We also have, as a teaser, a paper very soon to be coming out, which expands on some of the ideas within the manifesto. So I will talk a little bit about some of those ideas as well over the next 10 minutes as a foregrounding to the panel discussion, which I will outline when I come to the end of this introduction. So Margaret has mentioned this symposium, which was a fantastic opportunity for us as a group of feedback researchers from across the world to get together and talk about this really uncertain time that we're facing now with generative AI and its role in education more broadly, but in particular for feedback and the potential for technologies such as generative AI to play roles within feedback processes. And we recognized as a group the potential for generative AI to both support and distort feedback processes. We're not anti-AI. We believe that there is a strong role for generative AI as we move forwards in crafting feedback processes. But we also see potential and have seen potential within our own contexts for the use of generative AI in feedback to be driven by the wrong principles or by untested assumptions. And as we discussed different futures involving generative AI in feedback processes, we realized that a lot of these future situations were things that we couldn't even predict. We couldn't anticipate what kinds of questions we might be asking about feedback and generative AI in a year's time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. And so we realized that there was a need for us to be talking about a set of principles or what we felt were the non-negotiables, the things about feedback that we have to hold on to and that we don't want to see eroded by any kind of technological advance. And these are the kinds of principles that ensure feedback stays ethical and, most importantly, meaningful. And as we talked and as we crafted the manifesto and the paper that followed, we realized that the meaningfulness of feedback processes is not just about learners. There is a huge amount of importance in engaging in feedback processes for us as educators. And so holding on to those principles is what we aim to do with the manifesto. So we position this manifesto as a call to action for researchers, policymakers, leaders, and teachers and students within higher education. We are facing these very complex decisions about how to engage with generative AI in education. And whilst we can't predict the future conundrums or challenges or opportunities we might face, if we have a series of principles, then we can uphold what is valued in feedback processes. And when we come across one of these as yet unseen situations, principles such as those within a manifesto can be used as a compass to guide decision making when we're faced with uncertain terrain. So I'll very briefly outline the principles of the manifesto to you now. You're seeing them 10 on the screen. For anybody who is involved with research in feedback, practice in feedback, and has attended any Cradle event in the past, you will be familiar with this baseline contention that feedback is not comments, or comments are not feedback. Information, words on a page, words spoken, constitute input into a process but are not themselves feedback. And this is a really key conceptualization in feedback scholarship over the past 15 to 20 years, and one that has been absolutely central to advancing both research and practice. So whenever we're thinking about the role of generative AI in feedback processes, we are talking about just that, a process. We need to move beyond the idea that generative AI can do feedback because it can write comments. That's not feedback. Second principle, feedback is a relational practice. Feedback takes place through connections, interactions with others. For a student, that could be educators, it could be peers, it could be spaces, tools, technologies. Feedback is not the isolated transmission of information from one place to another. And with that idea of feedback as a relational practice comes a lot of complexities that we risk ironing out by focusing on the role of any kind of technology to replace or augment human practice. The third principle, feedback can be messy, uncomfortable, challenging, but also joyous. As we talked about our own experiences with feedback, both as educators and as learners or students ourselves, we realized that part of feedback's transformative potential comes through the messiness and comes through the challenge that we often experience when we're faced with evaluative information about our performance, about our work, about our ideas. And this mess, this discomfort is absolutely central to being able to experience transformation through feedback processes. If we try to make feedback in any form too simplistic, too simple, too instantaneous, we miss that mess, the challenge, and the opportunity to experience genuine transformation through feedback. Feedback should be an ethical practice. There is considerable challenge for an individual or a group in putting themselves forward for evaluation and receiving information or engaging with self-evaluation through feedback processes. This means that respect and transparency and equity are central to effective feedback processes. This doesn't mean that technologies can't play a role within feedback processes, but holding on to feedback as an ethical practice, thinking about the importance of transparency, respect, and equity is central to how we can move forwards in a way that doesn't undo all of the good work that's taken place in framing feedback processes. Number 5, feedback should promote learning over time. The impacts of feedback are complex, they're not linear, they're often delayed, they're often circuitous. If we see feedback as something that can come immediately and the process then being completed, we're missing out on a lot more of those more complex, long-term diversions in the impact of feedback. So whilst there is benefit to technology in being able to produce feedback immediately and at scale, we shouldn't then use that as a proxy for feedback having had impact, because often it's the conversations, it's the incubation, the time we sit with feedback that can lead to those strongest impacts on learning and change over time. Number 6, feedback and associated technology should be designed in conversations with learners and educators. There are so many tools on the market already that involve artificial intelligence in feedback processes. I would question how many of these have had genuine input from educators and learners in the process of development. This means that they might be focusing on some affordances of AI and ignoring the ones that matter the most. So where are the genuine challenges in feedback processes from the perspectives of both learners and educators? Where are the pinch points and the frustrations, and how can generative AI help with those rather than just simply being used to deliver feedback information? Feedback engagement requires time and care. We see a lot in practice, but also in the literature, with this idea that feedback is a burdensome practice, particularly for educators, the amount of time that it takes, and that this time is somehow a problem, and that we should be looking at ways to save time in feedback processes. Now, this isn't new in the context of generative AI. The idea of saving time in feedback processes, making them more efficient, is something that we've seen in research policy and practice for many years. But as we talked about feedback processes, we realized that the time and the labor that is spent on feedback in all its forms has real value, not just for learners, but for educators as well. We learn through engaging in feedback processes. We learn about the effectiveness of our teaching. We learn about what students might be struggling with. And it encourages us to go back into that role of learner and to think about what it means to be evaluated and to then try and move forward in our learning and our skill development. So we shouldn't only think about saving time, we should also think about the value of time. When we're making decisions about feedback processes, we put learning at the center, number 8. Now, this one seems quite simple. Of course, we're interested in student learning and student development, but often efficiency, compliance, the need to make things more scalable is what can drive thinking and decision making. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, those imperatives actually don't sit easily alongside the focus on student learning. So whenever we're faced with an uncertain decision, how do we incorporate a technology such as generative AI into feedback processes? Let's start with learning and what it does there. The last two, feedback can be enhanced by digital technologies, but digital technologies do not always enhance feedback. We shouldn't rush to deploy a new technology just because it's there. Design should be intentional, and sometimes it's best to leave things as they are. And finally, more feedback is not necessarily better for learning. Yes, tools like generative AI can produce large amounts of feedback in a timescale that it simply isn't possible for a human to replicate, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better for learning. Sometimes less information is better for learners than more. Sometimes too much feedback information can be overwhelming, make it difficult to work out how to move forwards. So more is not necessarily better. Before we move on to the scenarios, I just want to finish by outlining something that we've written about in this paper, which will be coming out soon. And we position in this paper feedback processes as careful, as in full of care, and the importance of care and situating care within feedback processes. And recognizing that any move that we take in incorporating generative AI into feedback processes should draw upon these values that we've presented within the manifesto. But we finished the paper by talking about the future and what we saw as 4 areas where we need to keep respect for in this uncertain future. The first is the respect for scholarship. So there has been a significant amount of conceptual and empirical work over the last 15, 20 years, which has really challenged our basic assumptions about what feedback even is. That scholarship is really crucial to how we move forwards. And this move in particular, away from seeing feedback as comments and feedback information towards seeing feedback as a process, is incredibly important and something we need to continue to respect and hold on to. So when institutions, for example, are talking about how to involve generative AI within feedback processes, this scholarship needs to maintain its central place within the dialogue, and it's up to all of us to continue to advocate for that scholarship. If we simply see generative AI as a way to write lots of comments quickly and at scale, and to produce or transmit feedback comments, all we're doing is replicating what has been argued against for many, many years as a very simplistic view of feedback. So let's start with the challenges we see within feedback as a process and think about how we can use the affordances of tools such as generative AI to help us move forwards. The second thing we argue for is respect for equity. So we don't know anywhere near enough yet about how tools such as generative AI might be reproducing, exacerbating existing differentials in attainment between different groups of students. And because we don't have that understanding, and we don't have that understanding in a really context-specific way, any conversations we're having about generative AI and feedback need to maintain respect for equity. The third respect is respect for professional craft. So in the paper, we argue that the process of engaging in feedback for educators is a professional craft. It's something we've learnt to do. It's something we've shaped through experience and seeing how our practices influence our learners and our colleagues. We hear a lot in the literature about the risk of skills being eroded if they are outsourced to generative AI. Now, is this a risk for the craft of feedback if it becomes heavily outsourced to generative AI? And also, what is the value of engaging in feedback processes for us as educators that we could potentially lose if we play less of a role within feedback processes? Feedback as a process gives something back to us as educators, and that's something we should hold on to. Finally, is a respect for human connection. So we recognize the value of people within education. That doesn't mean there isn't a place for tools such as generative AI, but holding on to the respect for human connection, what that brings within a feedback process, what it does for learners and for us as educators, is something we should hold on to in the uncertain future. So what we're going to do now is move on to the panel discussion. And what we've decided to do here is, rather than ask questions of each other, we're going to ask questions of the manifesto. So we're going to think about some of these messy, uncertain situations that we might face in the future, and think about what the manifesto might help us to do in terms of moving through our thinking in relation to those principles. So we'll move on to the panel discussion now.
Okay. I hope I've got this order right, but I think I'm going to start us off with scenario. The first scenario. So this is a scenario I crafted thinking. So I'm Christy Noble. I work within a medical school. So the scenario should resonate for a lot of people who get their students involved in communicating, and also particularly for this scenario, it's about patient interaction. So what we proposed, and my colleagues are going to test the manifesto against this scenario, is we've got second-year medical students, and what's been introduced to them is an AI-enabled virtual patient system. So they can practice weekly their history taking. So they engage in a 10-minute encounter, and after they've done that, AI instantaneously offers possible solutions in the order of rank in terms of missed questions, possible diagnoses, and then provides them with a polished summary. So by the time the tutors meet their, but by the time the students meet their tutor, and they're having their small group debrief, they've already seen what AI thinks. They've already seen what the diagnosis should have been. And often the students are walking into the session saying, I know that I missed this diagnosis because AI has told me. So this is before the tutors had an opportunity to even unpack their thinking. And what's happening and what's unfolding is that tutors are rarely encountering students' authentic reasoning pathways. Rather, what they're seeing is the students' reflections on those AI interactions. So I'm going to hand the mic over now to Kelly, who's going to test one of those principles for us.
Hey, Christy. Hi, everyone. When Christy first shared this scenario with us, I guess my attention immediately went to Manifesto Principle 3, which is that one about feedback being messy, uncomfortable, challenging, and sometimes joyous. It prompted me to have a think about my own experiences of feedback and also my engagement in the feedback process over the years with students. And I think for me, the moments that really stick with me are those challenging and uncomfortable ones, those ones where there's some degree of emotion or affect, and those ones where I or the student often got something wrong or misunderstood or failed to meet the level of expected competence. The challenge, for instance, of talking to a student about how they haven't demonstrated competence in a placement scenario or a work integrated learning scenario, or for me more personally, one I vividly remember is the challenge of trying to build a theoretical framework into my PhD thesis and not really understanding at the time why I needed to do that, and doing a really poor job of it that initiated some fairly pointed feedback in response. I think that those uncomfortable and challenging times, as Naomi talked about, really have transformative potential, and they help to shape shape our experiences and our transformations in our discipline. And they're also absolutely fundamental, I think, to developing critical self-reflection, value judgment, and fundamental learning. And reading the scenario and thinking about principle three, I think about what slots do we use AI to alleviate some of that challenge and struggle, as appears to be happening for those students in this scenario. But then my thoughts turn to a young person who I know very well, who's currently in her second year of university. She's neurodiverse. She experiences regular anxiety, and in her earlier years prior to university, didn't really believe she'd have the capacity to succeed in higher education. She still regularly feels a bit lost and overwhelmed with what's required of her at uni. But Gen AI feedback can help her make a start. It can help her navigate uncertainties without feeling silly or feeling that she needs to bother someone, the tutor or her peers, to ask a heap of questions. It helps for her to limit that sense of overwhelm. There's still plenty of challenge and messiness and discomfort for her, but the Gen AI feedback helps the work to seem and to come achievable. And that achievement and that feedback and the process and its contribution to her achievement can be quite joyous. I think these examples illustrate for me that messiness and challenge and discomfort are different for different people. And I wonder if Gen AI can help with that. I thought a bit about, in preparing for today's Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and how that zone's different for different individuals. And I wondered if whether we can end up in a place where Gen AI feedback, if it's used judiciously, can really act in the role of maybe a knowledgeable other as you know, one of those tools that Naomi mentioned in the relationship principle, the relational principle. So I guess to finish up, I'm interested in whether we can use Gen AI with care, and I emphasise care here because it's front and centre of the manifesto and of the paper that Naomi's talked about, so that we can remove for some students, some, but not all, because we acknowledge that challenge and messiness is important, but some of that challenge and messiness, so that we can support and enable more students to achieve and to reach that point where feedback and learning are joyous. And I'm going to hand over, I think, to Anna for a different perspective, or maybe the same perspective. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to talk about Principle 4, which is the idea that feedback should be an ethical practice and it should promote respect, it should be transparent, and it should be based on professional standards. And in thinking about this scenario, I felt that AI in this case can provide students with feedback with no preconceptions or biases or ongoing repercussions. So the feedback that they'll be receiving will not take account of race, age, gender, sexuality, appearance, etc. And it does give the learner the opportunity to rehearse, to mess up in private. It gives the opportunity to have a go without feeling uncomfortable in front of a teacher, a senior, or a peer. And so in these ways, it does remove the power imbalance. It can allow learners to take risks in a safe environment. No patient is ever going to be endangered in this scenario. However, there are questions that it also raises, a scenario such as this raises. It's not developmental, which is something that Naomi was talking about. It's not, the feedback that they're receiving in this scenario is not built on any previous learning, nor is it built on the finer details of context. It doesn't take account of what's going on in this particular context, but tends to generalize the solution, diagnosis, for example. there isn't a professional and a nuanced professional dialogue involving professional judgment. It's a conversation, if you want to call it that, that has removed some of the messiness, some of the clinical thinking, the clinical reasoning. The student is not able to see the process of thinking as a diagnosis is made. So that messiness is removed. So indeed, perhaps is the joy. There won't necessarily be in a process such as this acknowledgement of the finer points, the messiness of making a diagnosis, which isn't necessarily a simple or linear process. There is no acknowledgement of the communication skills required in taking a history or the power imbalance between a clinician and their patient, or any of the contextual peculiarities of that particular patient in that particular moment with their own needs, possibly communication challenges, etc. And for the student, the difficulties of communicating with patients. It doesn't build communication in this way, the communication with the AI. In this scenario, it doesn't necessarily build trust or teamwork or communication, which is learnt from working collaboratively with other clinicians and with patients. And so it tends, and I think something else that's worth thinking about in a scenario such as this is that, at least at the moment, AI tends to use the dominant voice rather than the unvoiced and the invisible or the less visible. And so in thinking about history taking and diagnosis, it's thinking about the dominant, possibly perhaps the dominant way of presenting or the dominant ways of being human. And so my question in thinking about this scenario in terms of this principle, again, to go back to Naomi's point about it being careful, full of care, is this a way of teaching students to think with care? Is it a meaningful encounter? Is it a careful encounter with all the subtleties and complexities of human interaction? And I suppose my question for you is, does that matter? Thank you. I'll hand over to Karen.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Naomi and Kelly, as well for the thoughts so far. Just to summarise and to sort of close the thinking with respect to that scenario, I think it's become evident that actually what happens when you think with the manifesto about specific situated feedback encounters is that it becomes clear that there's a number of complex and quite thorny questions that we might raise. This particular scenario really poses a challenge to a number of the points on the manifesto. For example, the notion that feedback is a process, the notion that feedback should promote learning over time. Kelly was talking about how feedback should be messy, uncomfortable, challenging and joyous, and how this particular situation might problematize that. We also might want to think about how does this situated example work if we think about learning, not efficiency or compliance being the primary driver of thinking regarding feedback processes. So in sum, I think we need to consider carefully what matters in each particular learning experience, such as this one. If we are still valuing the skills that the medical students might be able to develop during the history taking, and these might be omitted or lost, then we need to think very carefully about how we introduce technologies in this particular situation. However, being mindful that there may be affordances as well as future issues that we haven't yet considered. So a number of complex questions and ideas that the manifesto really helps us to articulate, I think. And I believe now we are able to move on to our second scenario of this webinar. So I'm going to, I think we're going to have those available for us to see, and I'm going to introduce this scenario.
Hang on, Karen. I'm just going to jump in. We're running incredibly short on time. So I'm just wondering, do you want to just introduce the scenario to lay it out? And then rather to go to commentary on it, we'll just jump straight to questions, if that's okay.
Great plan. Thanks, Margaret. So yes, so the second scenario that we have that we will just leave you as a teaser to think about so that we can have lots of time for your questions. So this scenario is again thinking about a potential future situation. Future classroom tools, future classroom technologies integrate deeply with students' workflow. As a learner writes, codes, rehearses, or designs, an AI agent observes patterns, anticipates errors before they occur, and delivers micro interventions unprompted. For example, you seem to be misunderstanding this. Please pause and reconsider. What might be the impact of such integrated technologies with the students' workflows? What might change? What might occur from this normalization of AI technologies within the feedback process? So we're going to leave you with that second scenario to think with, and then I think we're going to move straight to questions. Is that right, Margaret?
That is right. And sorry, I was a bit slow in getting that scenario up. Don't
worry.
It was causing me a challenge, but I will cut and paste it into the chat for people. So that's something else for everyone to think about. How might this be working? And to also give you a teaser, we were going to talk to, I think, Principle 1, feedback is a process, not corrective comments, and Principle 8, learning not technological efficiency or compliance to drive thinking and decision-making regarding feedback processes on that scenario. So I'm going to ask everyone to return now because the questions have gone very wild, shall we say. There are many questions. And the first question, which I'm going to kick off from, and because we're short on time, what I might do is start with one person to answer, and then we will might see if anyone else will join in. This is from Dave Bowd. I'm going to throw it to Naomi, I think. Dave asks, which of the principles risk being both most neglected, but perhaps be most important in the new contexts in which we find ourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think the first answer that comes to my head here is that first one of feedback as a process, not comments, is almost the foundational one for all others. I feel like if we can make sure that doesn't get neglected, that will help us with many of these different new contexts that you mentioned that we can't anticipate as yet. And that's also the one that I feel we hold on to most strongly and that makes me feel most uncomfortable, I think, is just this risk of lacking respect for the scholarship that has taken place and making sure that stays central to the decisions that are made by very well-meaning leaders or policymakers that may see generative AI as a solution to many of the wicked problems that we face in higher education. But to me, I feel if we can hold on to that one and continue to advocate for feedback as a process, not just comments, it will help us with upholding many of the others.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Would anyone else want to have any other comment on that?
I will, Margaret. I'd like to put a shout out for Principle 8, that learning should always be central. I think in the current higher education environment, you know, this idea that Gen AI can save us time, save us money, improve our efficiency is really quite strong, as Naomi talked about at the start. And I think that that as much as we might want learning to be at the centre of anything, any process where we build in Gen AI into the feedback process, that is at risk because of all the other things going on in the sector and the world.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I'm going to move on to, and I hope that answers your question, Dave. I'd like to move on to Chris Frost's question. And they write, this may be coming in the scenarios. I don't think it does entirely. It did a bit from Anna, but I'm really curious to your thoughts on how AI could support feedback without undermining the deeper purpose of feedback, with examples if possible. Does anyone want to tackle that?
I'm happy to say something, Margaret.
Go for it.
But again, I don't know how clear this is as an example, but certainly it gives an idea of, I think, the thought processes that we could go through. So if we take feedback to be a process, something that supports learning over time, that enables us to sit with discomfort, to take time to work with feedback, that's very different to saying that AI could support feedback by writing comments. So that's probably something we would all get on board with. But then what I think it means in terms of how AI could support feedback without undermining that idea of feedback as a process is to think about the principled design for the use of AI and feedback processes, starting from the challenges that we know we face in enacting feedback as a process. So it's really easy to talk about feedback as comments. It's really easy to practice feedback as comments because it's simplistic. It's too simplistic. As we've tried to embed feedback as a process into practice over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen many challenges. Let's take a really simple one. In many higher education settings, learning is separated into modularized chunks, units, courses. I'm aware the terminology means something very different in different contexts, but the idea that students learn in chunks and take separate assessments in all of those chunks, that often means that feedback is separated into those artificial chunks, and it's very difficult to connect the feedback together across different learning events, across different assessments. And it's really hard for us as educators to help join those dots, because we often only see students' work within one context and not in others. We might also be having to look at their work anonymously in line with policies and procedures in local contexts. So as one example, what can generative AI do to help in terms of building that bigger picture of feedback, to connect the dots across different learning cycles and learning events, and overcome some of those challenges of enacting feedback as process within a heavily modularized, siloed curriculum?
Fantastic. I might go on to the next question because there are so many. So be prepared, panel. I might ping you. Gen AI is useful because it saves time, but more to the point, because it can, with a well-prompted assistant and oversight by human in the loop, give really high-quality feedback. How do we persuade students that this form of feedback is not AI slop and they haven't been cheated because AI has been used? Karen, do you want to share this?
Happy to speak to this. Absolutely. I think we've already considered some of the potential affordances of Gen AI technologies, and I think there's lots of, exciting opportunities ahead. But I think what I would question is whether we can make sort of sweeping judgments. So I think if we burrow down into that question a little bit more, we can't say that all Gen AI text or feedback would be useful, and neither can we say that it would all be slop. And we can say, of course, that with careful judgment, we can make effective use of Gen AI technologies, but then that leads us also into the murky, muddy terrain of, how do we ensure that our students are able to develop that evaluative judgment and are able to interpret and work with Gen AI technologies appropriately, and what does appropriate mean? So I think there's a lot of work ahead for us to support the ability to work with technologies. And I think the other really genuinely fascinating question for us as educators going forward is thinking about how, when we work with technologies, the work that we produce becomes reshaped and changed, and the boundaries between human and machine become blurred. So I think absolutely there are affordances, and there's work that we can do with students, but I think it's complex, and it's not going to be an either or. So yeah, it's a great provocation there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And another question, and sort of a lot of these questions I think are sort of revolving around similar points. A key challenge in large enrolment courses is the consistency and quality of feedback, particularly when assessments are marked by academics or sessional staff who are not directly involved in teaching the students. This raises the question of whether Gen AI could support more consistent, developmentally focused feedback, and how such tools might address variability in feedback quality while maintaining academic judgment and disciplinary standards. So this is really sort of coming to some of the challenges we face in feedback. I'm hearing this commonality. These are some of the challenges we face in feedback, and how could Gen AI help? So Kelly, Christy, Anna, any takers for this one? I'll go to one of you three. Thinking music.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think feedback. I mean, I think yes, feedback from humans is variable. I don't necessarily see that as always a problem. That it might be different, and that's sometimes a good thing. So I think we should be a little bit hesitant in thinking that human feedback is often flawed, because I think all feedback is potentially flawed. I think it's a matter of balancing the strengths of both and thinking about what humans can do that AI can't, and what AI can do to augment that, and how we can teach students as well to think critically about all feedback that they're receiving, and educating students to think about their feedback and their feedback needs.
Fabulous. Sounds a little bit like feedback literacy for you there, Christy, as well too, Anna. I wonder, that comes to Svetlana's question, which given that it's feedback literacy, Christy, I'm gonna ask you to respond to, which is, how can educators support students to think and engage critically with AI generated feedback?
That's a lovely question. So it's about thinking about how students can productively engage with AI generated feedback. So I think it's a lot of the work that we do, certainly with our students, is helping them understand what effective feedback processes constitute. So for them, I think it's being intentional about helping our students understand what this feedback process is, and then getting them to work with these. And I think part of that would be almost like a feedback literacy curriculum, where you're getting them to practice engaging with AI generative feedback and working with them on that, so that they're starting to test ideas. That could be a really practical activity that you're including within your courses to get them, and then working with them and scaffolding that approach across the course. So I think it's hitting it front on and saying, this is what it is, this is what they've got to do, this is a skill that they're going to need to develop. Let's work with them in developing those capabilities. So that would be one way I think about that.
And sort of adding on, it's funny how one set of questions are really clustered around how we as teachers use AI, and we're moving really firmly here into what students do. And Phil Dawson has asked a question that sort of builds on what you just spoke about, Christy. He's asked, the manifesto as presented today is focused on pedagogical feedback, i.e. processes designed by teachers, including things like tech or peer feedback. Do you also think about AI feedback instigated by students in the manifesto? We can influence that, but we can't control it. And I'm going to throw open to the whole panel to attack that one if anyone wants to have a go. I have views, but I leave it to my colleagues. And then I think we're going to think about wrapping up, even though we've still got so many fabulous questions. So does anyone want to have a go at thinking about how we can influence students beyond?
Margaret, I like to think that when we build good relationships with students, that we hopefully can help to influence their feedback practices, whether they're directly with us or outside of what we do. And I thought a lot when we were preparing for today about what we're preparing students for. And I think that that's really important when you apply the manifesto. What world of work are we preparing them for? And I know that's changing rapidly, but I like to think that we might be able to influence students so that they see learning as central to how they use Gen AI in feedback processes, even if that's at home and they're, you know, jumping onto ChatGPT because they're not sure where to start with an assignment or because it's due tomorrow and it's 10 p.m. But I kind of see that the manifesto can be applied in that instance too, albeit that we have less control over how and whether it's applied.
And are we teaching them to think? We're not just teaching information transfer, but are we teaching them to think and to think critically?
So I really am so thrilled with so many amazing questions. And I think that the thinking that lies underneath this has been really brought out beautifully by our panelists. I'm going to give them the last word. So I'm going to scooch around and I'll tell you the order, panelists, so you know, colleagues, friends. The order on my screen is Karen, Kelly, Anna, Christy, and Naomi. So giving Naomi the last word, but giving Karen the first of the last words. Karen.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, I think there's just two tiny points I'd like to say, and I think the first one is that one of the key takeaways for me from the manifesto is how we think about feedback as a relational practice. And I think this discussion today has really surfaced the ways in which the affordances and the challenges entangle, the ways in which humans and machines entangle and become blurred. And I think we need to ask, you know, what is the tech doing, and how are the processes being changed and reshaped? Are these productive? Are they problematic? Are they moving towards fostering the kinds of learning experiences that we want to achieve for and with our students? And then the last tiny point I'd like to just say is I've noticed in the chat, and it's really wonderful to have all these thoughts on the manifesto, additional points to consider, and your views as well from all of those in the audience. And I'd just like to reiterate that the manifesto is given now over as a provocation for further debate, further scholarship, and we welcome ongoing thinking and challenges and developing of our initial ideas. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. And Kelly, your 2 cents worth.
I'll be really quick. I guess I'd just like to reinforce that point around thinking about what students will do as graduates as fundamental when applying the manifesto and thinking about our feedback processes. And I'm from a health disciplines as well. And, you know, in particular, the complexity and the contextual factors that influence what our graduates in health will do. As much as we might like to make things more speedy, more efficient, more smooth for students, and sometimes that's what they desire too, that's not what the world that we're preparing them for.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. Anna, over to you.
I suppose my final thoughts are a question, which is how can we best use AI to think of feedback as a process and as a learning process. So it's a question rather than a comment.
Wonderful. Thank you. We can do with more questions in these uncertain times because I think we leap too hard to certainties. Christy.
Thank you. So mine's a challenge or a fun thing, I think is how I'd say it. I think play with the manifesto. It's quite fun, and I found it quite fun playing with the ideas in the manifesto and testing them against the scenarios. So for each of you, I think about your local context and your challenges with AI and test this manifesto, see what it opens up. It really does offer fresh perspectives in a way that we can work with AI. So enjoy it, make it joyous.
Wonderful. And from Joy, Christy, to the last word, Naomi.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you everybody so much for your really strong engagement with the ideas. It's so fantastic to see the questions, the pushbacks, the challenges that you've raised within the Q&A. So thank you. One of the comments that really stuck with me was somebody who said, we weren't really fully on board as a sector within education with feedback as process even before Gen AI. There was still huge potential for us to really solidify these ideas of feedback as being much more than comments. And I feel like that means right now we're faced with a really strong opportunity that, because we're being forced to confront challenges within feedback because of the role of generative AI, it gives us an opportunity to really reassert what matters, and an opportunity to be freed from the pressure of talking about consistency and volume and speed and the kinds of things that actually don't mean a lot when we think about feedback and what it's going to mean in the future. So we all have an opportunity to influence the future, to prevent the proliferation of AI slop in feedback, and to push back against the idea that machines are useful because they can save educators time and because they can produce lots and lots of information very, very quickly. All we just need to keep saying is, that's not feedback.
So on those words, that's not feedback. Thank you so much for joining us this time. Thank you particularly to our UK colleagues for getting up at 7 a.m, joining this webinar at 6:45 a.m. in the morning, and then sharing with us such glorious thoughts. And also, of course, to Kelly, Christy, and Anna. And one of the great things about, can I say, about this collaboration has been the ability to join ideas from around the globe. It's really been utterly delightful. And we, as to echo Christy, we look forward to hearing your thoughts and ways of altering the manifesto, because it's meant to be a living document, kind of like feedback, a living thing. Well, on that note, wishing you all a very good evening, and I know Paige has posted the details of the next Cradle webinar seminar series in the chat. So thanks to you all, and thanks to Paige.